This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder.
Historian David O'Keefe is back on the program. That's because he has a new book out. It's called 7 Days in Hell, and it tells the epic story of the men from the Black Watch during a bloody World War II battle. In addition to being a history professor, David is also a television producer and documentarian. He joins us via Skype from right here in Montreal. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Pete. How are you?
Jess, tickety-boo, thanks very much for being on the program with us once again. This particular battle, the one that you depict in the book, 7 Days in Hell, it's not one of the well-known battles, and I guess it's kind of overshadowed by D-Day itself. Would that be correct?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, most of the historiography and most of the press goes to the first day of the Normandy campaign, which, of course, is D-Day. But this took place about 6 weeks into the campaign, and it turned out to be the bloodiest day for the Canadian Army next to Dieppe, the big tragedy in 1942.
Okay, so tell us about this particular battle, where it was, and who was involved, because it was not just Canadians.
No, not at all. I mean, as a matter of fact, it's a Canadian operation led by the 2nd Canadian Corps, but it also had British units in it, the 7th Armoured Division and the Guards Armoured Division. And it was a battle essentially for Verrières Ridge. And the way that the Canadian High Command viewed it, particularly the general who led it, General Guy Simonds, was this had an opportunity of being his Vimy Ridge of the Second World War. And they were taking on, it was fought at a little place south of Caen, which is the big capital of Normandy. And it's a ridge line that runs about 7 kilometers south. And it was tactically and strategically dominating ground. And the Germans had basically set up their entire defense for the eastern part of Normandy along this ridge over the couple of days leading up to the battle. So basically it was a race for time to be able to get the ridge or wrestle the ridge from German hands before they fortified it and would make it even more costly.
When generals plan battles and set out what they're going to do in any particular campaign, they kind of assess what casualties are going to be like and how successful they would be. Was this particular battle as successful as they wanted it to be, worse or better?
No, this turned out to be, sadly, an unmitigated failure. They really hoped that they would be able to draw the Germans into a nasty battle of attrition, where at the end of the day, they'd be able to use their overwhelming superiority, numerical superiority in tanks and aircraft and artillery to destroy the German panzers. But sadly, things went off the rails almost immediately, and as a result, it was the Germans who turned the tables on the Canadians.
Was it a domino effect? Like, what went off the rails, and did that lead to other things going off the rails?
Well, yeah, it's kind of both, actually. The plan, right from the start, was not a very good one. It was a plan that was basically war by timetable. So General Simonds had a very tight control over it. He was a real micromanager, and he made sure that everything was scripted. So that the people on the ground who were actually fighting at the sharp end, who could see what were the events that were unfolding in front of them, really had little initiative on the day. So when a couple of units ended up getting behind time and there were casualties that people didn't expect, and the Germans, of course, reinforced the area, his plan started to collapse right at the beginning, and it just spiraled downhill throughout the day.
When it comes to looking back at it from a historical point of view, we tend to spend a lot of time looking at our successes as a nation when it comes to battles, but not necessarily things that didn't go as well as they should have. Is it difficult finding information to write a book like 7 Days in Hell because we tend to look at the other battles, especially considering there were so many big battles just before it with D-Day?
Well, in some ways it is, but you have to realize that we've been blessed in Canada. We had an incredible Army historian by the name of C.P. Stacey, and he had a whole team of historians that traveled with the Canadian forces. And although he was indeed under Army command and subject to all the chain of command that you would expect, he was very good. He was, number one, a historian before he was an Army officer. And what he used to do was, even though he couldn't report or write about something at the time, he would note it down and leave it for future generations of historians to use. And of course, I benefited from that. So I've been able to go in and, for instance, take a look at what General Simonds, who at the end of the battle realized it was such a disaster and tried immediately to massage the story. So in other words, put his own spin on events and downplay the massive casualties that his corps took under his command based on his plan. So as a result, you would think it would be very difficult to get your hands on this material, but because of the incredible work of Stacy, who was truly dedicated to his craft, there has been a lot that was left for, like I said, future generations like myself to use.
Percentage-wise, how many did we lose in that battle?
Well, this was the second bloodiest day next to Dieppe, and in the Second World War for Canadian soldiers. We lost 1,500 men on that day, and about 500 were fatal. So we lost 500 men in about 6 hours of combat. And for my book, I've concentrated on the unit that suffered the heaviest casualties, and that was the Black Watch from Montreal, who out of those 500 men who died, 126 came from the Black Watch.
Wow. And of the numbers, what were the total numbers of Black Watch members who went?
Well, the Black Watch, when they made their fateful assault on July 25th, 1944, they started moving up the slope of Verrières Ridge with 320 men. And 24 hours later, only 20 men were fit for duty. The rest were killed, wounded, or missing, or in German hands.
Wow. So in doing a book like this, I mean, you talk about, obviously, you've talked about how you've had a lot to work with and work from for your book. Is there any first-hand accounts? I mean, first of all, we're way past that time now, so the chances of somebody being alive are slim, but even slimmer with a smaller group to start with.
Well, you're absolutely right. Luckily, for the survivors, the ones who ended up in German hands, when they came back, they were interviewed by Stacy's historical team. Some of them, the survivors who actually made it out that day, were interviewed around the time as well. But I started the research for this back in the early 90s. So I was able to sit down with a few of the men who sadly are all gone now, and I was able to get their stories. Now, of course, I'm getting their stories, 50 years after the fact. But at least their stories were recorded before they passed on. So it's a mixture of contemporary archives. So, for instance, war diaries, message logs, things that were created at the time. Plus, of course, the interviews that I did in the early 90s and any of the other material that was left over.
You've done several books now. How do you go about choosing the topics that you want to do a book on? How did you go about choosing this particular battle for 7 Days in Hell?
Well, I think partly it's mystery, and also too, I think it really is just righting the wrongs of the past and making sure that there's a true understanding of what happened on a particular day. I guess one of the most objectionable parts of this whole episode was that at the end of the war, when Simmons was asked to account for what happened, he decided he was going to blame it on those who died and who could not answer back. So as a historian, that kind of stuck in my craw, and I decided that I was going to investigate it and see exactly what the truth was behind this and kind of give voice back to people who lost it many, many years ago. So that's kind of what drives me for these things.
Has it gotten easier for you as time goes on, because you do have, pardon the pun, a little bit of history in the fact that you've written several books, you've done television shows? Are people more open to having you tell their story or their ancestors' story because you have been successful in telling these stories in the past?
Oh yeah, there's no doubt. It becomes a snowball effect. You can, when you call somebody up and you explain who you are and they clue in, usually the floodgates open. As a matter of fact, I've had cooperation from many of the families in writing this book, and I've been able to get my hands on letters that were written at the time before, some of these men were killed. A lot of emotional stuff, and also too, the stories that they knew about their families, and also they've opened up too. Some of the men that I focused on were not all saints, and so as a result, there were some painful chapters and painful moments that do come up in the book, and a lot of that was provided by the families. And I guess after working on this for so many years and developing the reputation that I have in the field, there's a certain amount of trust that the families or the participants will have, and it does make my job a lot easier. But I think more importantly, it makes the history a lot richer.
You mentioned the men who went off to these battles, but in doing what you do, from our perspective as a society, when you look back at these, especially if you see the family letters, they're just kids, aren't they?
Oh, God, were they ever. The average age of the men who went up Very Ridge was about, when I say men, 22 or 23. So essentially a graduating university class. And it's remarkable because even though that was the average, there was a significant amount of them that were 18 or 19. I mean, these are the age of my students that I teach in college. So it's kind of, it's strange when I walk into the classroom and take a look at my class and realize, okay, you could have been a platoon with the Black Watch at Verrières. That is striking. That really puts things into context. And of course, reading the letters not only, from the men themselves back home, but from, to their mothers, because most of them weren't married. It was their mother and father or brother and sister that they were corresponding with. And then, of course, going through their personnel files, you see probably the saddest artifact you could ever find, which is, of course, the telegram home that broke the news that they'd been killed in battle.
Wow. Another fascinating story. The book is 7 Days in Hell. David, thank you very much for being on the program with us once again.
My pleasure, Peter. Anytime.
Military historian David O'Keefe, author of 7 Days in Hell. You can go to my website at thestuffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0516, and you'll find links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can pre-order his book directly.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.